The envelope is sitting on the dining room table when Marguerite walks in. It's a plain white rectangle. Standard legal size. The return address is a law firm in Hartford, Bellingham Cross and Vane, and it has already been opened, which means someone got to it before I did, and that someone has gone very quiet in the corner of the room near the china cabinet that belonged to her grandmother. Renata Colebrook Ferris does not go quiet. That is not something she does. She has opinions about the thread count of tablecloths and the correct pronunciation of bruschetta, and whether a woman with a teaching salary has any business marrying her son. She has never in 4 years been quiet in my presence. So I sit down. I fold my hands on the table next to the envelope. And I wait. This is the story of what was inside it. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories New. If this is your first time here, we tell stories about quiet people who were underestimated for too long. Stay through to the end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that now because justice, when it finally arrives, moves fast. My name is Delia Voss Marchetti. I was 31 years old when this began, and I was a high school chemistry teacher at Bridgewater Regional in Western Connecticut, AP Track 11 years, department head since I was 28. I owned a 1,400 square foot house in Torrington that I bought alone at 26 with a down payment I saved in 4 years on a teacher's salary by doing private tutoring every Saturday morning, and not taking a vacation for 3 consecutive years. I did not come from money. I came from a father who repaired small engines out of our garage, and a mother who kept the books for 3 local businesses, and taught me that a ledger tells you more about a person than any conversation ever will. I tell you this not to impress you. I tell you this because the Colebrook Ferris family would later argue that everything I did was calculated. And I want you to understand, I have always known how to calculate. I simply chose at every turn to calculate for the people who were being written off. The person being written off in this story was my husband's grandmother. Her name was Aurelie Ferris. She was 83. She had built the Colebrook Ferris Furniture Company from a single workshop in 1962 alongside her late husband Desmond, and she had retired at 75 and handed control to her son Clifford, Renata's husband, who then handed it to their son Weston, who was my husband. The company was worth, at the time of her retirement, approximately $10 million in assets and contracts. Aurelie lived in a small apartment attached to the main house. With a separate entrance and a garden, she maintained herself until her hip made kneeling impossible. The family visited her on major holidays. They spoke about her in the third person when she was in the room. When I met her at Thanksgiving the year Weston and I started dating, she was sitting alone at a small table near the window while the rest of the family occupied the long table across the room, and nobody had thought to bring her a second cup of tea. I brought her the tea. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about the workshop, about Desmond, about the smell of linseed oil and the weight of a properly balanced plane. On the way home, Weston said, "She likes you." I said, "I like her." He looked at me like that was surprising. It wasn't. The pregnancy was real. I need to say that plainly without defense, because Renata's version of events required it not to be. Weston and I had been married 14 months when I became pregnant. It was planned. We had been trying for 7 months, and I had tracked every cycle on a chart I kept in the top drawer of my nightstand with the same methodical attention I gave to my AP chemistry curricula. When the test came back positive on a Tuesday morning in February, I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time just breathing. We told his family at dinner. Renata's response, and I am giving you her exact words because they matter later, was, "How convenient given the timing." Weston said, "What timing?" She smiled and changed the subject. The timing she meant was this. Aurelie had, 2 weeks earlier, revised her will. I did not know this at the time. I would not know it for months. But Renata knew because Clifford had been informed by the family's estate attorney, and Clifford told Renata everything, and Renata had been watching me with a particular quality of attention ever since. The dinner invitation came 3 weeks later. It was Aurelie's birthday, her 84th, and Renata was hosting at the main house. The invitation arrived by text to Weston. "Dinner Saturday. Tell Delia she's welcome to come if she's feeling up to it." If she's feeling up to it. I was 10 weeks pregnant and exhausted in a way I had not anticipated, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and doesn't move. But Aurelie had called me herself the day before and said, in the careful voice she used when she was asking for something, "I'd like you there, Delia. If you can manage it." I told her I could manage it. I made her a lemon olive oil cake, her favorite, she'd told me once, something her own mother used to make in Calabria, and drove 40 minutes to the main house with the cake wrapped in a dish towel on the passenger seat. The foreshadowing, which I could not see at the time, was sitting in Renata's kitchen when I arrived. A notary public stamp on a document that was quickly turned face down on the counter. Renata's hand came down on top of it. She smiled at me. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. "It's Aurelie's birthday," I said. "Of course," she said. And she put the cake on a low shelf in the refrigerator and closed the door. The dinner was 15 people. The long table. Aurelie at one end. I was seated at the far end from her, between Renata's sister Phyllis and a cousin whose name I never learned. Weston was seated next to his father. Aurelie was seated next to no one she particularly wanted to be next to. The evening proceeded. There was a catered meal. Renata did not cook for events, and wine that nobody offered Aurelie because she'd had one small cardiac event 3 years ago and Renata had appointed herself the arbiter of Aurelie's restrictions. Aurelie had sparkling water and her hands folded in her lap. The announcement came with dessert. Renata stood up and tapped her glass. She said she had something to share with the family. She said she had done some research. She said that she had spoken to the estate attorney. She said the words that she had been building toward for 3 weeks. Delia's pregnancy is very well timed. Aurelie's revised will includes a provision for any grandchildren born within the next calendar year. And I think this family deserves to know that Delia's medical records, which I obtained through a contact, show no prior fertility consultation, no treatments. After 7 months of trying, Phyllis's fork went down. Weston said, "What records?" "I'm simply raising a concern," Renata said, "that a woman who married into significant assets is now conveniently pregnant at the exact moment the will was revised. I think Aurelie deserves to know who is performing for her." The room was very quiet. Aurelie's hands were still on the table. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I said, "Renata, you just described illegally obtaining my private medical records and suggested I fabricated a pregnancy to defraud an 84-year-old woman who has never been anything but kind to me. I need you to understand that I heard every word of that." Renata said, "If you have nothing to hide." "This conversation is over," I said. Weston was standing now. Renata turned to Aurelie. "Mother Ferris, I just think you should." Aurelie said, "That's enough, Renata." 3 words. Perfectly level. It was the first time I had heard her use that voice, and I understood immediately that it was a voice she had used before and had chosen not to use for years. Renata sat down. I went to Aurelie's end of the table, offered her my hand and said, "Would you like to get out of here?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Let me get my coat." We left together. Weston followed. Behind us I heard one person, the cousin I think, push back their chair as if to stand and then stop. I chose not to look back. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing there worth the turn. We spent the next 4 months building a different life, in the way you build things when resources are genuinely limited. One decision at a time with full attention to each one. Aurelie moved into our Torrington house 2 weeks after the dinner. She took the guest room, which had a window that looked east. She was up every morning before I was, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee already made, and a second cup waiting for me on the counter. Our household income dropped by the amount of what Weston had been drawing from the family business, which was $6,200 a month. He found work with a small regional contractor within 3 weeks. It paid $4,100 a month. We were short. We adjusted. I kept teaching. I picked up one additional private student on Tuesday evenings, a quiet sophomore named Marcus who was trying to get into an engineering program, which brought in an additional $240 a month. We stopped eating out. We ate at home, which turned out to be better because Aurelie cooked. She had not cooked in years, she told me, because Renata had taken over the main kitchen and Aurelie's apartment kitchen was too small for real work. Our kitchen was not large, but it was real. She made a ribollita one Thursday that I am not exaggerating when I say was one of the best things I have ever eaten, thick with cannellini beans and wintergreens, the kind of dish that tastes like it has been thinking for days. We ate it at the kitchen table, all three of us, and Aurelie said, "Desmond used to say that a soup knows when it's needed." I thought about that for a long time afterward. There was a folder. It appeared on the kitchen table about 6 weeks into this arrangement, and Aurelie placed it there herself and then went to tend to her window plants without explanation. It was a standard manila folder with no label. I did not open it. It appeared again on the counter 3 weeks later, near the fruit bowl, and once more near the end of month 3, resting on top of the stack of mail. Each time I moved it gently to the side table in the hallway where we kept the things that needed attention, and I said nothing. Renata called twice during this period. The first call was to Weston. She said that the family had discussed the situation and they were prepared to offer Aurelie a more appropriate arrangement, meaning the apartment in the main house, if Weston would return to his position at the company. This required as a condition that I step back from the situation. Weston asked what stepping back meant. There was a pause. He hung up. The second call was to me, which surprised me enough that I answered it. Renata's voice was different, lower, with less performance in it. She said she wanted to apologize for how the dinner had gone. She said she had been under pressure. She said she hoped we could move forward. I said, "I appreciate you calling, Renata." She said, "I just want what's best for the family." I said, "I know you believe that." And I hung up because the baby had just kicked for what I was certain was the first time, and that felt like the appropriate moment to end the conversation. If you've stayed this far, you already understand what kind of story this is. Subscribe now so the rest of it finds you when the rest of it matters. Aurelie died in April. It was not unexpected. Her heart had been working harder than it should have for 2 years, and her doctor had been honest with her, and Aurelie had been honest with us. She died at 6:14 in the morning in the east-facing guest room, with the early light coming in and a cup of coffee still warm on the nightstand from where she'd had it an hour before. She had been in our house for exactly 4 months and 9 days. The last thing she said to me the evening before was this: "The folder is for you, Delia. Not for Weston. For you." Our daughter Cora was born 11 days later. The funeral was handled by the Colebrook-Ferris family. We attended. I carried Cora in a wrap carrier because she was 11 days old and I was not going to leave her. Renata looked at the baby and then looked away. Clifford shook Weston's hand. Nobody spoke to me directly. 3 weeks after the funeral, the letter arrived from Bellingham, Cross and Vane. The meeting was requested by the firm, and they requested the full family. There were 9 of us in the conference room on a Thursday afternoon in May. Weston beside me, Clifford and Renata across the table, 2 of their adult children, a cousin, the estate attorney Harmon Vane, at the head of the table. Harmon Vane was in his 60s and had the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had made his peace with it. He said that Aurelie Ferris had revised her will in January of the prior year, not, as Renata had implied, 2 weeks before my pregnancy announcement, but 14 months earlier, shortly after she had met me at Thanksgiving. He said the revision was substantial. He said that Aurelie had left the majority of her personal estate, not the business assets which were bound by separate instruments, but her personal estate, valued at $2.3 million in investments and property, to me. Not to Weston. To me. Delia Vos Marchetti. By name. Renata's chair scraped back. She said, "That is not possible." Harmon Vane set his glasses on the table and said, "Mrs. Colebrook-Ferris, I drafted the document myself." Renata said, "She manipulated her. This is exactly what I said, this is exactly what she." Clifford put his hand on her arm. Her voice got louder. One of their daughters put her face in her hands. And then Renata said the word she had used at the birthday dinner. The same word. Performed. She said I had performed my relationship with Aurelie. That I had calculated it from the beginning. Harmon Vane said, "Mrs. Colebrook-Ferris, your mother-in-law included a letter of instruction with the revised will." She anticipated this response. He slid a copy of the letter across the table toward me. I opened the folder that had been sitting in my hallway for 3 months. It was the same letter. Identical. She had given me my copy first. In the letter, Orally wrote that she had spent the last decade watching her family's capacity for care narrow to the dimensions of their own convenience. She wrote that she had watched Renata reorganize her life into something manageable and peripheral, and that she had said nothing for too long, because she was tired and because silence requires less. She wrote that Delia had brought her tea at a table by a window when no one else thought to, and that this was not a small thing, and that she did not want it to be treated as one. She wrote, "A person who makes room at their table when the table is small has already shown you who they are." I looked up from the letter. I looked at Renata. Renata's face had gone through several things. It landed on something that was not quite shame but was adjacent to it, a recognition, brief and involuntary, that she was seeing herself in a document written by someone who had known her for 40 years. Her daughter, still with her face in her hands, was crying quietly. I could have said something sharp. I had the materials for it. I said instead, "Orally loved your family. That was real. I don't think anyone should walk away from this room thinking it wasn't." Renata did not respond. Clifford nodded once, very slightly, looking at the table. The legal process took 4 months. Renata contested the will through the family attorney. The grounds were undue influence. The case was heard by a probate judge in Hartford County. The instrument of the challenge was the claim that I had isolated Orally from her family in order to manipulate her. The instrument of its dismissal was the dated record of the will revision, 14 months before I had any knowledge of the will's existence, 14 months before the dinner, 14 months before any of the events Renata had described as suspicious. The revision had been made after Thanksgiving. After tea at a table by a window. The judge ruled in 6 weeks. The estate was distributed as written. Before the ruling, I sent a single letter to Renata through the attorneys. I said that if the family chose to withdraw the contest, I would establish a name scholarship at Bridgewater Regional in Orally and Desmond's names, funded from the estate, for students pursuing vocational and trade education, which was, as I noted in the letter, the kind of education that had built the Colebrook Ferris Company in the first place. The offer was refused. The scholarship exists anyway. I funded it from the estate regardless of the outcome. It is called the Desmond and Orally Ferris Prize for Applied Work, and it gives $1,500 each year to a junior who demonstrates what the criteria document calls practical intelligence in service of others. Renata and Clifford have not spoken to Weston since the ruling. Their daughter Pemba, the one who cried at the conference table, sent us a card when Cora was born. It said, "She's beautiful. I'm sorry for a lot of things." We sent her a photo. Weston is back running the company. Clifford stepped back. The board asked Weston to return, and he negotiated his own terms, and he went back because it was his grandfather's work and that mattered to him, and I understood that. My life is mostly the same as it was. I still teach. I still wake up early. I make the ribollita now, from the recipe Orally wrote out in her careful handwriting on a piece of lined paper that I keep inside the kitchen cabinet door, held there with a single piece of tape. Cora is 8 months old. She sits in her chair at the kitchen table while I cook, and she watches the steam rise from the pot with the focused, unguarded attention of someone for whom everything is still a revelation. Orally used to say that a soup knows when it's needed. I think about that every time I make it. That some things carry more than their own weight. That what you offer at a small table stays in the room long after you've left it. The real inheritance was never the money. It was the knowledge that showing up for someone quietly, consistently, without an audience, is the most durable thing you can do. If there's someone in your life who eats alone at the small table by the window, sit with them today. Not because it will be rewarded. Because they are there and so are you, and that is enough. Share this story if it found you at the right time. Leave a comment if you've been Orally. And subscribe because there are more stories and the people in them deserve to be heard. I'll see you in the next one.